The loss of a capital warship rarely begins with a catastrophic mechanical explosion. It starts with a small shift in weather that turns a modern bridge into a room of guesses. Fog erases the Bristol Channel, and one small error in the numbers slips through the gray. The current slides her sideways without anyone seeing, and the ship's line quietly bends toward Lundy's granite. When steel meets rock, a fortune in sovereign hardware is pinned against the shoreline. The stranded platform is His Majesty's ship Montagu. The sheer violence of the grounding and the need to recover the ship's 12-inch main guns will force salvage engineers into an unprecedented logistical operation. To reach the wreck from the landward side, the engineers will later carve a steep staircase straight into the living granite of Lundy Island. Recut during the salvage and breakup phase in 1907, that permanent scar is still known as the Montagu Steps. The year is 1906. The Royal Navy is projecting supreme global authority through its expanding fleet of heavily armed capital ships. The Montagu is a Duncan-class pre-dreadnought battleship, an elite engineering platform designed to outpace and outgun rival foreign fleets. Her power plants can drive her steel hull through the water at an impressive top speed of 19 knots. This makes her one of the fastest battleships on the planet. At this moment, she is not engaged in combat. She is operating as a mobile laboratory for the future of naval warfare. The crew is conducting highly classified trials with early wireless telegraphy equipment, attempting to communicate over the horizon without physical cables. It is a moment of supreme technological optimism. Yet, the ocean cares nothing for human technology. Late in the month of May, the weather over the channel deteriorates rapidly. A dense, impenetrable fog descends over the water. The fog does not silence a wireless set, but it cannot give the bridge a visual fix in a gray world with no horizon and no landmarks. In that instant, the crew is thrown back into the ancient maritime practice of dead reckoning. They must calculate their present position based only on their last known location, their estimated speed, and their compass heading. This is the deadly trap of navigational drift. In zero visibility, the ocean current and wind silently push the mass of the ship off its plotted line. The navigator makes a crucial error in his math. He believes the battleship is safely positioned miles off Hartland Point on the mainland. In reality, the Montagu is drifting miles away from her intended track, heading straight into the hazardous waters surrounding Lundy Island. Operating under this false assumption, the crew attempts to verify their safety using the oldest tool in the Navy. They drop a sounding lead into the gray water to measure the depth beneath their keel. The line pays out and strikes the seabed. The crew reads a depth of 17 fathoms. In their minds, it sounds like deep, safe water and plenty of clearance below the hull. But around Lundy, the seabed geometry can lie. In thick fog, a single sounding can become false comfort, reinforcing a course that is already drifting toward rock. Confident in their dead reckoning, the command staff allows the massive warship to continue creeping forward through the blinding fog. Just after 2 a.m., about 2:10, on May 30th, 1906, the illusion shatters. The battleship slams into the submerged granite teeth of Shutter Rock, off Shutter Point on the southwestern edge of Lundy Island. The kinetic transfer is absolute. The forward momentum of the great ship drives the lower hull directly over the jagged rock formations. The grinding impact tears a catastrophic 91-foot gash straight through the starboard side plating. In the chaos of the collision, the commanding officer issues an immediate and desperate order. He commands the engine room to throw the massive steam engines hard astern in a frantic bid to pull the ship backward off the rocks. It is a fatal misjudgment of the physical forces at play. The lower hull is already pinned and heavily deformed by the granite shelf. As the immense torque of the engines tries to drag the ship backward, the ship remains locked in place. The unyielding rocks catch the spinning propeller blades. The tremendous rotational force shears the propellers completely off their shafts. The ship is now fixed fast on the rocks, no longer a mobile warship. The immediate concern shifts from navigation to sheer survival and the protection of the ship's primary strategic assets. The vessel houses 4 irreplaceable 12-inch main guns, each an immense steel cylinder weighing 48 tons. These weapons are the primary reason the ship exists. Now they are trapped on a sinking platform. With the lower hull violently halted on the rocks, how long before the ocean completely equalizes the internal spaces? Within about a day, the sea begins to conquer the internal geography of a grounded capital ship. The breach destroys watertight integrity. Water floods the lowest compartments, kills steam, and takes the lights, leaving the battleship immobilized on the rocks. With the bottom open to the sea, the wreck enters tidal equalization. The ocean dictates the waterline inside as surely as it does outside. Each tide lifts her just enough to shift the loads, then drains away and drops the weight back onto the rock. This equalization creates a lethal structural crisis. When a warship is properly floating, the upward force of the water evenly supports the entire length of the steel keel. The weight is uniformly distributed across the hull. However, once the buoyancy is permanently lost, the dynamic changes entirely. The massive dead weight of the heavily armored hull, the upper decks, and the internal machinery now bears down directly on the unyielding granite shelf below. The ship is supported only at a few brutal contact points where the rocks meet the metal. Furthermore, as the tide recedes and the internal water drains out, the ship loses the temporary buoyant support that the flooded water provided. The hull is subjected to massive, unequal stresses. The steel structure is forced to bridge the empty gaps between the rocks, acting like an overloaded metal beam. Every time the tide drops, the enormous downward gravity threatens to crack the spine of the vessel. The structural yield limit is being tested twice a day. The physical reality of a 91-foot gash means conventional damage control is overwhelmed. Engineers can try sealing arrangements and external cofferdams, but the tides and the twisting hull fight back. Each cycle strains the structure, opens seams, and defeats whatever temporary seal can be built against the rock. In the end, the breach is not unpatchable in theory. It is unsealable in practice at this site under these forces. The platform is hopelessly trapped and experiencing extreme mechanical stress with every passing tidal cycle. The ocean is slowly tearing the rigid structure apart through sheer weight and the relentless gravity of the tides. Saving the ship or salvaging her highly valuable components requires a massive industrial intervention before the steel skeleton completely collapses. And the platform is hopelessly pinned and requires an immediate industrial response. But who would control the strategic logic of the operation? The Navy's first instinct is to save the ship, not strip it. That institutional pressure sets the tone for friction at the wreck site. Admiral Sir Arthur Wilson assumes total and absolute control over the initial recovery effort. He brings the full weight of military authority to the coastal rocks, expecting the sheer force of command to overcome the physical disaster. However, the Admiral severely lacks practical experience in the brutal mechanics of heavy commercial salvage. Driven by the urgent need to claw back buoyancy without a dry dock, desperate ideas begin to circulate. Among them is an old salvage expedient, cork. Packed into spaces that cannot be pumped dry, and it can displace some water and by small margins of lift. But it cannot defeat an open wound in the bottom plating, and it cannot outrun a coastline that floods and drains the ship twice a day. The pressure to achieve a miracle refloat slows the shift toward a practical, phased extraction. Recognizing the stalling progress and the mounting complexity of the coastal disaster, the highest levels of the Admiralty are forced to look outside the strict military chain of command. The Admiralty turns to Captain Frederick Young of the Liverpool Salvage Association, bringing in commercial salvage experience to shape what happens next. Young comes in to solve a salvage problem in mass and geometry, not to defend a symbol. The arrival of the civilian expert instantly sparks an intense operational conflict. Young evaluates the crushed lower hull and the relentless tidal forces acting upon the steel. He immediately recognizes that the platform is geometrically compromised beyond all reasonable recovery. He dismisses the massive cork injection proposal as a complete waste of critical operational time. While the rigid naval hierarchy remains stubbornly fixated on saving the ship as a singular, functional entity, the commercial salvage officer views the wreck entirely differently. To his trained eye, the battleship is merely a doomed, temporary container holding highly valuable and entirely salvageable military assets. Young forces a radical shift in the strategic calculus of the operation. He argues relentlessly that the primary focus must completely pivot from the futile attempt to float the broken hull and directly toward the aggressive extraction of the irreplaceable main battery guns and the heavy internal machinery. The ship itself is officially a total casualty, but her immense armament is intact and recoverable. The commercial logic is brutal, efficient, and ultimately correct. The true priority is to strip the platform bare before the approaching winter sea states permanently dismantle the steel skeleton. Through disciplined technical argument and sheer mechanical reality, the civilian engineer slowly overrides the initial naval fantasy. He establishes a clear, phased protocol for lightening the stranded vessel and extracting the heavy hardware piece by piece. The operation officially transitions from a chaotic rescue mission into a highly systematic industrial teardown. The salvage engineer successfully secured the authority to extract the massive heavy artillery, but the hostile surf zone completely cut off all conventional access for traditional heavy lift barges. The fundamental problem of coastal salvage is that the very rocks that destroy the ship also protect the wreck from rescue. A brutal geometry trap defines the operation at Shutter Point. The ocean approach is choked with reefs and violent surf, making alongside work brutally dangerous and often impossible in heavy weather. In narrow windows, slack water, low tide, brief calm, small lighters may come close, but the margin for error is razor thin. The landward side offers no relief. A sheer granite wall rises straight out of the surf. The heavy platform sits completely isolated in a boiling cauldron of white water. I've physically cut off from any conventional method of logistical support. To execute the massive industrial strip-down required by the new salvage strategy, the engineering teams need unbroken, continuous access to the main deck. They must seamlessly move hundreds of men, heavy pneumatic cutting gear, massive lifting tackle, and daily provisions onto the wreck. Relying on small transit boats navigating the lethal tidal surge is entirely too slow and deeply hazardous. A single misjudgment in the chaotic surf zone would instantly smash a fragile supply boat against the unyielding iron hull. The salvage engineers recognize that surface water access is fundamentally incompatible with the speed and scale required for a major hardware extraction. They must find a mechanical method to completely bypass the coastal tide. The engineering solution requires taking the entire logistical supply line directly into the air. If the violent sea cannot be crossed horizontally, it must be bridged from above. The salvage crews conceptualize a massive suspended transport line connecting the towering rock face of Lundy Island directly to the upper superstructure of the stranded warship. This requires extreme high-tension rigging under severe maritime wind conditions. The engineers must purposefully turn the hostile geography of the island into a structural advantage, utilizing the immense natural height of the cliffs as an anchored crane tower to span the destructive water below. Work gangs scale the precipice and begin drilling massive steel anchor bolts deep into the living rock of the cliff face. Securing the landward side is only half the battle. On the seaward side, the receiving anchor must be positioned high enough to maintain proper cable tension and keep the moving payload well clear of the breaking waves. The highest stable point remaining on the sinking battleship is the heavily reinforced steel roof of the main chart house. Crews deployed on the ship secure heavy mounting brackets directly to this upper deck structure. Between these two rigid points, they string a heavy-gauge steel transport cable using immense mechanical advantage to pull it violently taut across the empty void. In 1907, the teams build a reinforced aerial walkway from the cliff steps to the wreck. More than 10 tons of material suspended over the surf, completed in a matter of hours. It turns the site into a connected workyard. Men, tools, goods and stores can move above the breakers in almost any tide and weather. With access finally solved, the question shifts to the hull itself. Can it be sealed and dewatered before winter finishes the job? An unimaginable volume of seawater has to be moved just to make a refloat attempt plausible. On the upper decks, a forest of pumps is assembled, hoses disappearing into the flooded depth as crews fight to pull water out faster than the tide can feed it back in. Alongside pumping, they attempt air-assisted dewatering, sealing what openings they can, forcing air into compartments to drive water away from critical spaces. For a moment, it looks like brute machinery might hold the line. For a brief operational window, the massive combined assault of hydraulic pumping and heavy pneumatic injection appears to hold the line against the ocean. But the salvage crews are fighting a secondary, invisible enemy that is completely immune to extraction hardware. The lethal reality of structural deformation is rapidly tearing the warship apart from the inside out. The massive weight of the heavily armored citadel and immense upper decking is no longer supported uniformly by a buoyant column of deep water. Instead, the ruined hull is resting unevenly on irregular, jagged granite pinnacles beneath the waves. The enormous, unrelenting force of gravity is actively pulling the unsupported sections of the heavy keel downward into the empty gaps between the rocks. The strain announces itself in sound and failure. Rivets shear, bulkheads groan, and the hull slowly bends over the granite. As seams split open across the ship, the pumps can move about 8,600 tons of water an hour. But the sea simply pours back through the new cracks and the air pressure cannot be held. The machinery is winning, but the container is coming apart, forcing the Admiralty toward a final decision. A successful coastal operation is rarely a complete victory. It is almost always a brutal mathematical trade-off. At Shutter Point, the engineering command must willingly sacrifice the immense steel body of the stranded warship to secure the highly concentrated strategic value of her heavy armament. The massive ship is dying, but her weapons are perfectly intact and completely irreplaceable. This cold industrial calculation permanently defines the final phase of the extraction operation. By August 1906, after the refloat effort stalls, the Admiralty ends the attempt and pays the ship off. From here on, the Montagu is treated as a platform to strip. Before winter sea, states finish what the rocks began. The priority tightens to one outcome: get the 4 12-inch guns off the wreck. The hull can be surrendered, but the armament has to come back out. The salvage crews descend heavily on the massive armored turrets. They must meticulously separate the vast weapons from their complex internal hydraulic mounts, without damaging the extremely precise rifling. They carefully dismantle the heavy steel enclosures and slice through the thick protective decking using specialized cutting equipment. The operation is incredibly slow, deliberate, and highly dangerous. The heavy lifting tackle must be rigged perfectly to handle the immense dead weight of the high-tier ordnance. Floating gear can only be used in brief, dangerous windows, and it cannot be treated as a dependable daily solution at this shoreline. So much of the lift has to be generated on-site. Block and tackle, improvised rigging, and hard mechanical discipline anchored to whatever structure still holds. The brute force required to hoist these immense steel cylinders from the dark, flooded barbettes into the open air pushes the rigging equipment to its absolute operational limit. Slowly, the engineers pry the massive 12-inch guns completely loose. Through sheer mechanical force and calculated leverage, they elevate the immense steel tubes out of the ruined mounts. The successful extraction of all 4 primary guns permanently validates the entire civilian salvage strategy. By aggressively pivoting away from the impossible refloat attempt early in the timeline, and the engineers secure the most critical hardware on the ruined vessel. They systematically strip the secondary armament, the high-value internal optics, and the sensitive communication equipment, leaving nothing but an empty metal carcass locked onto the coastal rocks. The final outcome of the operation is fundamentally split. The primary mission to save the mobile weapons platform is an absolute failure. The ocean completely defeated the structural integrity of the steel hull. However, the secondary mission to secure the vital military hardware is a profound industrial success. The salvage teams recovered the essential combat power of the vessel, returning the irreplaceable heavy artillery back to the active fleet supply chain. With the high-value extraction fully complete, the industrial supply lines are entirely dismantled. The remaining steel skeleton is formally surrendered to the relentless tidal forces of the ocean. The heavily stripped wreck is eventually sold for commercial scrap metal, leaving contracted divers to slowly tear away the remaining armor plating over the following decades. One of the most visible traces on land is still that scar in the granite, the Montagu Steps. Offshore, the wreck remains part of the seascape as well, a protected reminder of how a single navigational drift can turn imperial steel into coastal ruin.